Hey everyone, Joseph Myers here with Brad Henson, and today we're going to talk through just everyday things when it comes to bringing your church uh, back to whatever we're going forward to, and what it's like to lead ministry in a digital age. Brad, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Thanks, Joseph. You and I met years ago through Lynn Sweet because I had read The Search to Belong, and it ended up becoming one of the primary references for my dissertation at the time. And the revelation of what social space and private space and those kinds of things just really helped me frame some things that had just come naturally before, but helped me communicate that to others. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor since the '90s, and church planter. And just in kind of a unique, weird way, January 1st of this year started a new role at a larger church at Cornerstone Church in Southern Illinois and Western Kentucky. My job in the beginning was to plant a new campus in Paducah, Kentucky, and then maybe one day to oversee other campus pastors. But with the pandemic, as we were talking about earlier, my job has transitioned a bit. I guess all of our jobs have transitioned a bit, and basically just finding a way to shepherd people digitally and to try and be helpful, spiritually helpful and emotionally helpful and relationally helpful during the season. So one of the coolest things we've seen is that 10 weeks ago, I think we had 56 or 57 people in the launch team preparing to launch this new campus. And we were growing. We had a minimum of 100 people in the launch team we wanted before we went public. And when all of that was shut down and our ability to do worship gatherings in the local school that we were using, all of those things were, taken from us. We just immediately embraced the idea of connecting with people digitally. We started our team of communications and worship, and our pastor, Michael Nave, does a great job with our weekend teachings and those kinds of things. A phenomenal job. So we had great weekend content, but beyond that, trying to focus on helping people connect spiritually and relationally through this means of, we've all dabbled with Facebook for a long time, but now it became, at least for a season, our primary relational connection. And so basically what's happened is I started 5 different online small groups that were basically a combination of a closed Facebook group and a Zoom meeting once a week, those two things working together. So people would view our church's online service. They would do a Zoom afterwards to talk about it, and then they would chat in a closed Facebook group throughout the week about the things they were facing or dealing with. And what I found is that in growing those groups, as I just observed people who had specifically loneliness, anxiety, anyone who started sharing prayer requests on their social media, anyone who shared a nervousness, I just started reaching out to them personally, most of the time through private message. And what I found was over and over and over, without fail, when I offered not only to pray for them personally, but to connect them to a digital group where they could share their concerns and needs, and there would be someone responsible to keep track of that, and other people would chime in with prayer, and then they could, go to church digitally and participate in church online, but then have a Zoom meeting to talk to people about it and share their observations and applications of the teaching. We have had 100% so far. I have not had a single person turn me down. And our launch team has grown in 10 weeks from 50-something, 56, 57 people to well over 130 people now, just in the last 10 weeks. And we've not had a single meeting. We've not had a single worship service in person. That's all growing through digital connections.
It's just amazing to me. I mean, as you mentioned kindly that I wrote Search to Belong, and Search came out in 2003. And in 2003, just imagine, we didn't have Facebook, right? And so when digital communities started to arise in the more populous, general populace, they were villainized by a lot of our colleagues and made to seem like that if you're connecting in that way, it's quote unquote not authentic, not genuine. Uh, it's not face to face, and I've always said it isn't face to face, right? It's never supposed to kind of replace face to face. It's just different. It's a different kind of connection, but people do connect over digital space. It's come full circle now to now people are just begging to understand, not villainize, but actually kind of baptize this technology into our everyday lives. And so it's interesting to me to hear you say, you know, COVID has really pushed us all. It's kind of been that Tower of Babel moment, right? Where God's saying, hey, if you don't want to spread the gospel digitally, you know, I've given you this tool. I'm just going to separate you all and make you do it. So it's been a very interesting thing for me to see that that people do connect in all four of those spaces: public, social, personal, and intimate space online. When you've developed these groups, um, and you mentioned people come with, you know, we know that the studies show right now, the research shows that at least 25% of people are going to come back, quote unquote, to work, to church, to public places with significant trauma. How are you helping people kind of work through that? Maybe not significant, but, you know, through their trauma, and how do you think this is helping that?
Well, I think that the challenge with a filtered world when it comes to the way that we sometimes present ourselves on social media. One of the things that I see happening is that, you know, I've kind of picked on a filtered world for a long time because it's so easy. In just, you know, 12 weeks ago, it was so easy to make your life look better than it is on Facebook or Instagram. It was so easy to only take photos of the good food, you know, and only share the moments when your kids are smiling, and only, you know, do those things. What I'm seeing is that in the last 12 weeks, that's been wrecked, and people are getting to a place where there's a greater sense of authenticity, even if it's in a sense of fear, worry, anxiety that's caused it to happen. So it's kind of like you're scared enough that you can't fake the fact that you're scared, you know, now.
Right.
And what we're seeing is that, you know, I'm no sociologist or a psychiatrist, but I think most common sense folks would realize that no matter what trauma you're facing, loneliness emphasizes it or amplifies it.
Right.
And so whatever you're going through, loneliness amplifies in a negative sense.
Yeah, it just puts gas on the fire, right? It just
yeah. If you're struggling with addiction, loneliness makes it worse. If you're struggling with depression, loneliness makes it worse. If you're struggling with anxiety, loneliness makes it worse. So I don't know that I would say that we've effectively battled addiction or effectively battled those things, but we are effectively battling loneliness. And so to try and help people know that whatever they're facing, they're not alone. We have a young lady in my group that joined the group. None of us really knew each other very well. Joined the group. A few weeks into joining the group, had a major health scare. This is a single mom, small kids, living alone. And I'm sure that outside of our group, she had friends and things. I know that she has people that love her and care for her. But what I saw inside the group was I saw people her parents' age and people her grandparents' age and people her age and even a few folks younger than her all in one group, praying for her, paying attention to her, dropping her messages while she had to go into the hospital and couldn't be with her kids or couldn't be, you know, I saw people offer daycare, you know, like, hey, you know, we've never literally met physically, but if you need somebody to watch your kids, right. You know, sure. You know, what can we do? So what I saw her, you know, through the eyes of a pastor, I saw her deal with a hard thing without the added difficulty of loneliness.
Of being alone, right.
So that in and of itself to me is part of the real goal here.
Wow. Loneliness is such a deep emotion, right? It goes to our core. Um, I often tell people that there's four fundamental life searches: the search to belong, of course, the search for identity, the search for significance, and the search for hope. And I think that loneliness is the number one villain of all four of those. Like it can devastate all four of those very quickly,
Yeah.
um, and just tear at the core of who we are. Can I point something out that I'm going to push back on you a little bit? Is that okay, Brad?
Feel free, man.
I know that I think that it seems easier to be inauthentic or show the best of ourselves, only the best of ourselves online, right? I see that. But I also, it's so interesting to me because, I grew up in a family who went to church every Sunday. In fact, we were always the first ones there, always the first ones or the last ones to leave, that kind of thing. And I loved that. I love that about my life. But the most interesting thing to me was we would have our biggest family fights in the car. It took us about 25 minutes to get to church. We would just have bang out, drag down fights in the car. And as soon as we hit the church parking lot, you would have never known that we just came out of, war, a battle zone. So I think human beings are pretty good at doing this face to face. It just so happens that sometimes if someone is around us enough, the bad leaks out, the reality leaks out. But if they're not around us very much, there's plenty of people who think good of me who should not. So I think that it allows us to control that more, no doubt about it. It allows us to that facade, or used to, as you've mentioned. That I think people, that's kind of breaking down now because, and I think it's because people are around us more digitally now, where they weren't around us digitally before. Does that make sense?
It really does. I agree with where you're heading there. I do. Yeah, I think that the fact that we're just spending more time together digitally gives us the ability to see beyond the facade and probably builds in us a comfort level to lay down the facade.
That's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm with you on that. I think
Yeah, especially digitally laying down a facade. I mean, the brain, as we're talking face to face here, our brains are actually producing the same chemical as if we were face to face. Our brain is telling our, hey, they're connecting. They're face to face. Our brain makes no difference. However, our minds, where we learn behavior, shuts that down and says, whoa, wait a minute, brain. They're not face to face. But I think during this time, I've experienced and heard many, many people tell me, these days I forget that I'm even online sometimes with people. I just forget. Where we hadn't used it enough, many people, let me just say that, hadn't used the digital enough to let their minds get out of the way and experience. And again, I hope people don't hear me say it's not the same as face to face, but our brains are telling us it's the same. And then that allows us to kind of put things down mindfully and experience each other genuinely.
Yeah. I think you're right on, man. And I think that it's why for some people, for whatever reason, I shocked a few of my team members the other day and said, I actually like it better. I love a brainstorming meeting with 12 people in it on a format like Zoom. I enjoy it better. I feel like the words that I say are more well thought out. The fact that I can have a notepad here that's not on screen and I can be jotting down my thoughts while we're talking. But if we were all in the same room, that might look rude. If I was in some way multitasking or whatever, it might appear that I'm not paying attention. I love the opportunity to be able to really make sure I'm only sharing when I need to. And it also gives, it's probably been the number one thing I've observed, uh, I'll use the terms introvert and extrovert. I don't know that those terms really fit what I mean exactly, but you know, that person who comes to your group that never talks in face-to-face meetings, and that other person in your group that talks way too much. Um, it is so much easier to level that in this moment, where you can actually digitally say to the person who never speaks, "Hey, listen, why don't you share something?" And I mean, it goes so far as that we literally have the ability to mute the guy that won't stop talking. That won't stop talking.
Exactly.
So
I would love that.
yeah, so I think it levels the playing field for people in conversation and communication in a really sweet way.
That is so well said. And I think one of the contributors, let me know what you think about this, because I'm just talking off the top of my head like I usually do, is the delay. There's a delay. So there has to be a small space between people interrupting, and it's harder to interrupt digitally because of that delay than it is face to face. And so it allows you, I think, that time, that little space to actually think about what you want to say and not be so kind of spontaneous with your tongue.
Yeah, that's really, really true. That's very helpful.
You've just pointed me to some really good, I need to do some research on this, on digital delay and how that affects our connection, because I think it's significant. This is really well said, Brad.
Okay, so I have a philosophical question that I want your insight in, and I'm not asking you an easy question. I'm asking you a hard question. I called Lynn Sweet and asked him the same question, and he stammered around a little bit, and he's still thinking through this as well. Okay, um, so so in 2003, your book told me that there were 4 spaces that people interact within, from public space all the way to intimate space. So my question is digital space a 5th space, or is digital space simply a platform for the other 4? And I don't even know if the pragmatic reality of the answer is that much different. But so I'll say this and I'll shut up because I really want to hear your thoughts. Like, to use almost a crass example. So like, some might say intimate space is possible digitally. Look at pornography, something like that. And those of us coming from a Judeo-Christian worldview would say, yeah, that's there are things that are intimate about that, but that's not intimacy by any means, not at all. That's not helpful. That's not good. And so in that sense, that's a perfect example of major limitations to the digital space when it comes to things like intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
However, my wife and I downloaded a new app the other day that allows us to communicate by sending each other, like sweet little emoji smiles, or, I mean, and there's nothing, there's nothing but PG rated stuff, obviously, or even G for the most part, but it does seem to help with intimacy in the sense that it like gives you an opportunity to flirt a little bit, to just remind your wife that you're thinking about her, or, or something. It's all goofy usually, but it puts a real smile on my face, and it puts a smile on her face, and it makes it to where at the end of the day, when I get home from work, we're not forced to do this weird, hard transition from being apart. Now we're being together, which was always a hard transition for me, because if you don't watch out, you end up spending 2 hours talking about what you did all day and boring the other person with stuff that's not nearly as exciting to them as it is to you. It feels more like I walk right into, private and personal space like that. And I think the little connections through the day, I think they really, really help. And so anyway, I that's my question. Is it a 5th space, or is it just a new playground for the 4? And maybe even an addendum question there is, one of the thoughts I have is that it gives you the ability to be in multiple spaces at one time, in the sense that I can be in a business meeting, but then on a 2 or 3 minute, bio break, I can flirt with my wife. Like, that's Like that's such a sweet reality that allows us to move back and forth. So I'm going to hush. I want to hear what you have to say, man.
Just some really great insights. If you don't mind, I'm going to meander through the answer because you brought up so many touch points that I think are significant for us to at least consider. Um, I've always said, um, what I hope people do is at least for 5 minutes believe what I say. And so just give this 5 minutes, and you don't have to have the pressure of believing it's true for all time. I don't have that pressure of myself. So I'm going to meander through some things. When I did the research for Search to Belong, one of the things that became quickly apparent, which by the way, I researched for 7 years for that book, and did all kinds of. I have all kinds of data. Both quantitative and qualitative. So the interesting thing that became quickly apparent was I started the research in the US, Western culture. What about the other cultures? That all of a sudden it was like, do other cultures experience the four spaces? It quickly became apparent to us that the four spaces were very prevalent. It was a good model to talk about belonging in the Western culture. But what about Eastern culture? What about, so it just all of a sudden excited us. That's why it took 7 years, is because we went abroad. And I'm so glad we did, because what came out of that was, yes, all four spaces could be identified in each culture. However, every culture has nuances that they practice in each of the four spaces that doesn't make sense to the other cultures. Now, I think, and I apologize if I say this wrong, but I think you're old enough to remember Karate Kid 2. Karate Kid 2, do you remember that scene in that Daniel, he falls in love. They go overseas. He falls in love with this Asian girl, and she invites him over for dinner, right? And do you remember that scene? It was such an intimate part of the movie, and they never touched. They didn't kiss. The way the customs of turning the bowl around so that he could drink, every action was so deliberately intimate, but they were just having a meal. We don't have those customs really in the Western side, it was fascinating, I think, for our audience, the Western audience, to see that. But essentially what was happening was an intimate space that didn't at all look like an intimate space for a Western culture. So what we took from that and over the 7 years is that the behaviors in each of the four spaces are learned behaviors. Okay?
Okay.
Any question about that?
No, I get it.
So when I think about digital, I just think about it being another culture. And that what we're going through is a behavioral change in how we experience those four spaces. So
that makes really good sense. I like that approach.
Yeah. So I don't think it's like, Alex, and I can't remember Alex and Bobby wrote Discipleship That Connects. And they used the four spaces in there. And they came up with a fifth space that was kind of the holy space, the space that you experience God in. And both, they're good friends, and I've pushed on them a lot about this. But you experience God in all four spaces. I think it's a cultural thing. The digital thing is a cultural thing. It's not a new space. It's us having the fun of learning new behaviors. And I think, and I've said this before, but I think the wonderful thing about technology like this is that it really does take some quote unquote crisis to kind of catapult us into new cultural understandings. Um, it takes the crisis for us to understand, for instance, Black culture. For us as white guys, it takes a crisis for us to kind of step into that. It takes a crisis for, like, the atom bomb, the nuclear bomb. It takes a crisis for us to rebuild the world and understand Asian culture like we never did before. Um, so it's not, through history, this happens over and over and over again, that cultures become mixed and or a new culture evolves where we need to uh, develop new behaviors so that our minds, remember, our brain is actually spitting out the same chemical compounds. Our minds are what gets in where our behaviors gets in the way of us accepting that we can and we will connect in these ways. And what really pushed, I think, in COVID, what really pushed us to accept this is essentially, and whenever something happens, and I'm going to say in this case, technology, whenever technology emerges and I can't see, or someone can't see their grandbabies, and it allows them to see their grandbabies, it's going to be accepted.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah, that's good.
If I can't see my kids and digital is going to allow me to see my kids, I'm going to accept it quicker than if it's just kind of, if I see my kids anyway, why would I do this? If I can see my grandbabies. So I think that's one of the things that kind of the COVID thing pushed us to this kind of thing. So did that help? Did I answer the question? And then I want to spin something else out.
Yeah. Yeah, that absolutely helps. And it makes sense. I've mentioned even in American culture, there's a huge difference in, say, the behaviors in public space when you're on a street in New York City versus when you're on a street in Nashville, Tennessee. There are behaviors that are acceptable in Nashville that would get you, that would cause somebody to be afraid of you in New York City or something like that. So yeah, I get that. If you view it as a cultural context, then the way those spaces work, or the way I guess we work in those spaces, through a digital context, yeah, that's a really good way of seeing that. It's really helpful.
Yeah, and even as you mentioned, those subcultures, Nashville, New York. I now live in Montana. The joke here is 6 feet seems a little close. So it's those subcultures inform how, and we accept those, right?
Yeah.
How that we behave in each of those 4 spaces. And so if we think of digital, let's bring this back to kind of digital and groups and connecting congregations, maybe. If we bring it back to that, the big thing is that it is if we start announcing that these things, hey, by the way, we're going to get back to normal soon, so you don't have to do this digital thing. Sorry, that's probably not the best way to go about it, or to not figure out how to do this. I don't know if you saw, I did an interview with Rex Miller. Did you see that interview that was online?
I have not. I haven't seen it.
The interesting thing is Rex and I experienced this. We did this webinar with this new web tool called icebreaker.video is where you can find it. And what it does is it gives, it's like you go into it and it gives presenter with a chat room. So presenter is the only one you can see the video, hear the audio content. You can bring anyone up, quote unquote, what they call on stage. So you can make anyone a host. So you could have a panel or whatever that is. But everybody else is just in chat watching until you click a button. And during that time, what happens is the software randomly matches those who are online one-on-one in a video context. So you can see and hear each other. And then over at the side, it has little cards that you can go through and answer if you want, right? And then you set a time limit, and the as soon as that time's up, it kind of brings you out of that into the host room, and the host can say, the presenter can say whatever they want, and then send you back into those one-on-ones. Well, one of the interesting things Rex and I were talking about is what if we did that? What if we help people online in our worship services connect and not just watch? What if we use tools like that during, and so we choreographed our worship service totally different to where maybe after quote unquote point one, I know most people don't do 3 points anymore, but let's just use that as a context. Quote unquote after point one, the pastor says, hey, so for those of you online, we're going to send you into these randomly matched, conversations, and you'll have guide questions if you want on the side. But what we want you to do is just connect over what I just said. And by the way, here in the room, we're going to kind of do the same thing. Go, and it's going to be 6 minutes long. See you in 6 minutes. And it kind of went to that kind of thing. And then everybody came back, and we continued, quote unquote, as normal with an online worship service. Because I think we're going to have to help people not just watch. And for the first time in history, we've had a significant boom in people participating in church in the U.S. Significant boom. And to capture that momentum, I think we need to go the next step with that and not just have them watch, but actually connect with each other. And just what would it be like if your whole staff were online and got randomly matched with people? And or what if the pastor, up front got randomly matched with someone who's online? All of those things I think we have to at least start playing with to help digitally people connect, move them from that public space into a social connection online in our big worship experience.
Yeah. When I love this, I love what this could be. I led a church for 14 years that was in Western Kentucky, and we used to jokingly refer to ourselves as an ongoing experiment. Just everything was up for change pretty regularly, and one of the things we did, again, this is pre-technology usage, but I think it's mimicking what you're talking about, is instead of rows and aisles of seating, we had round tables, and there were 6 people at every round table, and our entire worship space, that's how it filled up. We got the idea from Japanese steakhouses, where when you walk in, you don't know who you're going to sit with. You end up, just at a hibachi grill, you're seated with whoever happens to be at that same grill. I remember the first time I went to a hibachi, it weirded me out, and I'm an extrovert, weirded me out that I was eating dinner with other people, and we didn't know each other, and it was a date. It was just my wife and I, and now we have to talk to all these other people. But afterward, I really got intentionally focused on trying to, how to do that with people. So we would have moments in the sermon where we would just did what we call table talk, where, okay, so we're going to pause. In 5 minutes, we'll come back. We're going to bring the lights up. You guys take a moment and talk about this thing we just talked about, this topic the pastor just shared. Mm-hmm. And we found that, there was a significant number of people who hated it, like absolutely hated it. But by and large, people loved it, especially when they knew to expect it. And it created the beginnings of, it was first date moments for people relationally. Yeah. It was some referred to it as speed dating for Christian fellowship. It was just like all of a sudden now, we would notice things like this. We would give them a topic to discuss, and we would notice they didn't discuss that at all. They just introduced themselves. Right. And it took 5 minutes for them to go, hey, I'm Joe. This is my wife. This is our kids. And then the 5 minutes is up, and you go back to do it. But what would happen after that is they would connect on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and then they would go, I was thinking about that. We didn't really talk about that thing at the table today that we said we were going to talk about. And before you know it, it made it very easy for new families, new people to feel like they had relationships very quickly.
Right.
And so I think that's what you're describing, just utilizing a different process or technology to pull that off, right?
Yeah, and what I think what's maybe even more appropriate is doing it digitally. You don't get stuck at a table with someone. You're in there for 5 minutes, and then you're back into this kind of public space
Yeah.
where it feels comfortable. Um, so yeah, but yes, that's exactly what I'm expressing, and because quite honestly, like I was talking to someone the other day who has a worship center that holds 1,000 people. When they come back, they can only hold 200 post COVID. Now just think what that cavern is going to feel like with 200 people in it. You know, I might go one or two times, but I'm not going to make a regular habit to go to a room that holds 1,000 with only 200 in it. I'm just not. I'd much rather see it online because I feel more connected. It's kind of like football for me. I'd much rather watch a football game on TV because I feel like I'm more a part of the game. I see more. I get the instant replays. But I do miss kind of the camaraderie or the public belonging of, hey, you know, all these sports people loving the same team I do. But I'm only going to do that if I'm going to do that fewer times than watch it on TV. And I think we're going to see that shift in church, is that people are going to like the online a little bit better, but we're going to have to somehow shift that so that they are continue to connect with one another and with the staff and pastors.
Yeah. Yeah, let me say something that will be an addendum to what you said earlier to make sure I think we're on the same page. I want to make sure you said that we had a kind of a revolutionary time where people were participating in church more than they had. I would probably push against the word participating and just use the word you used earlier, which is watching. So we have a ridiculous number of people watching church on a regular basis now, and that's good. But it does pose that problem that already existed, especially in attractional megachurches. The problem of people come to the gathering and watch and then leave. And that in and of itself is not disciple making. That in and of itself is not really the identity of the church. And so how do we make sure that whatever environment we're in, whether it's 1,000 people in a room, which, as you said earlier, for many churches is not going to be the reality of the future, or a bunch of families in their homes. How do we move people from watching to engaging? And how do we move people just from being consumers of Christian content to being lovers of the faith and livers of the faith? Not to use a word that doesn't exist, but that's really what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, but can I push against that?
Please.
So I think that public belonging is very significant in people's lives. Very. And I actually, through the Gospels, feel like that Jesus was very comfortable with people coming to watch the spectacle.
Okay.
I just see him walking through crowds and people grabbing at him and him being very comfortable with that, with them gathering in 5,000-10,000 people and just listening and never discounting that. Mm-hmm. Never saying that was now he called people out who became social belongers, personal belongers, and intimate belongers to him, and required other things from him than he did the public. But the one thing I really want to help us with is to not discount the significance that people give us, quote unquote, their public time. They give us their public belonging. It used to be a joke that there's people who only come Christmas and Easter. That it's true. There are people, but it's not okay for us to discount that 2 times a year may be all they can handle of us. and all they can handle of God at that moment in their life. And I'm not sure if it's not disciple making. I would say that it definitely doesn't resonate with take up your cross and follow me, right? But that's a different belonging to God and to Christ. That's a different, and I never see Jesus really discounting people who, in whatever one way they want to connect, they connect. And so for me, it pushes against, for me, this gracious understanding of how people connect and how they connect to God. Um, and I think God's a lot more comfortable with people connecting in ways that we're uncomfortable with, maybe by design, actually. But I just want to push on that a little bit, that I wouldn't discount it as not disciple
Yeah.
making. You
Let me
know,
clarify my language. I agree with you. I would say it's not disciple making in its fullest. Like, it's not all there is to disciple making. That's all I really meant to say. There are limits to what you can do in any one space.
no doubt.
Yeah, and so my question, I guess. So let me lead into this. It's a bit of a transition, but I think it goes right along with this. Is sometimes I wonder if we as churches are focusing all of our attention on producing the wrong, or at least not all of the right content. Because, so I attended a Barna webinar this week, and I don't need to. If I quote exact things, I'll get it wrong as to exactly who said it. But basically, coming out of that, there were some percentage numbers. There were some ideas that thought about, for instance, like somewhere in the neighborhood of a third churchgoers in America who were attending church fairly regularly before COVID are now currently viewing a different church's video on Sunday, and another third are viewing more than one a week, more than one church, so participating in more than one church a week, and at least one third who are not viewing their church's online gathering, who just said, I'm not doing it. And they're kind of holding their breath until they get to go back to church physically. And so you have these interesting thirds as to what's happening in society. So one of the things that really resonates with me is that there are so many valuable things when you think of space. There's so many valuable things when you think of the connections people make in a church or in a faith community. So you obviously have in the worship space stuff, I used the word space in the wrong way there, in the worship environment. So you've got the music, okay, you've got the preaching, you've got the prayer, you've got those things. But then you also have these lobby moments, which are the hugs and the handshakes and the smiles and the small talk. And you've also got the waves and the smiles in the parking lot. And you also have those people who remembered to ask you how your doctor's visit went, or those people who ask you if you like your new job that you just started, or those people who remember that your child left crying last week for some reason and they just want to check on them. So there are all these more private, personal, and I have a tendency to use those two words kind of interchangeably. You use personal in the book, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
So those kinds of things happen. And so one of the reasons why I've been so adamant about online small groups or online connection is that, we can reproduce really great music and preaching. You've got, there's 5 or 6 churches that do it to the highest of quality. I mean, like out of this, like a Life Church or something, like that just knock that out of the park. And the church I'm on staff with and a part of, I think that we do an excellent job with putting together a weekend worship gathering online. I'm very proud of what that team does, and I have almost nothing to do with it. But I just felt like, man, we can't only do that. We can't only project songs and sermons and think that we are digitally replicating church. There are so many other things that people are missing, and not to mention, unless you are, a Stephen Furtick or a Craig Groeschel or somebody, unless you're that guy, there's somebody doing that online worship service better than you are.
Yeah.
There's somebody out there that, and if 30% of people are watching another church versus their own, like that's at least part of that scenario as to why that exists. Their church's Facebook Live stinks. It's not very engaging, and they love the pastor or they love the song leader, but you know what? This Groeschel guy can bring it, and he's got a great band. So,
Right.
And I mean that towards Pastor Craig with great respect. Okay, I really do.
Yeah.
So my point being, I'm seeking ways that we can engage people digitally that have nothing to do with songs and sermons. That are many of those other places where, I mean, man, I think the number's up to 500. Last night, my two sons and I were playing ping pong, and we were like smack talking each other. They're both teenagers. We were smack talking, and Dad won 4 out of 4 games, and put them down. He like really, really roughed them up. Although they're both going to beat me very soon. But I just did a Facebook Live of Pastor Brad and his kids playing ping pong, and we had 400 and something views, like just really, really fast. And I'm trying to connect with, okay, maybe that's just another type of connection that help people to connect with humanity outside of their own home, outside of the limits of social distancing. So I'm seeing recommendations from people, things like, and some of this is going to sound really stupid to a lot of people watching this, I'm sure, but like, how about occasionally bringing your entire church into your dinner, into your meal at the end of the day, and sharing it with them, talking through it? How about what about the possibility of bringing your entire congregation into, what shows you've been streaming or what you binge watched over the weekend, or, to try like your morning coffee. Do you think there are ways to try and share those moments with a broader group of people in order to battle loneliness and those kinds of things and keep connection strong? I'd love to just turn you loose on that and let you talk about it, man.
Well, philosophically, you are so dead on, and what we call those connections are front porch connections. So those social connections, think of them as being the front porch of your congregation, those front porch experiences. And what do those look like? And how can we create front porch experiences? And what front porch means is that, for instance, I had a home in Cincinnati, Ohio, that the neighborhood was very active. People walked, and it actually was, mostly Jews. So there was a lot of walking, a lot of gathering, a lot of talking on the streets, a lot of dog walking. There just a lot of activity. However, if I wanted to talk to a neighbor, I either had to talk to them in a public space, or I had to bring them into my home, into a private space. And it both at times felt weird. Not that the public was bad. It just felt like, oh, we'd like to move this to a different kind of conversation. And so I noticed that my neighbors down the road built a front porch 2 doors down. And all of a sudden, people would be walking by and then go up on their front porch and start talking. And they weren't in public any longer. And they didn't invite them into their home, but it was a different conversation, right? And so I built myself a front porch. I'm like, I got to get into this. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is that those experience? How can we do that digitally? How can we create online digital kinds of conversations? And I think you doing ping pong was one of those. Hey, I'm going to bring you up on the front porch and we're going to just smack around a ball and that kind of thing. Or I think dinner, having online, there's so many corporations now doing happy hours. So there's the happy hour that all they're doing is creating this front porch. because people create those naturally when they are face to face. So we just need to build these spaces on our quote unquote, our houses, our church houses, our digital church houses that allow people to have those kinds of conversations. A part of the research for Search to Belong, when we were doing it, it was we binged watched Andy Griffith, every Andy Griffith show, and we made notes on every time it was a front porch scene. And one of the wonderful things about that is the cadence of what happens on a front porch is so interesting, because it has a lot of, even on the show, had a lot of dead air to it, had a lot of space between conversation, had a lot of, you know what I mean, that feel of just kind of that good country, Paducah country kind of flow to it, right? And yet at times Opie would get in trouble and Andy would correct him on the front porch. Or things like dating happened on the front porch. You know, one of the tragic things about the American experience, American automobile, is we moved dating from front porch to back seat. We changed the space of where people dated, where they courted. And we do that with church people too. We change. We don't provide the space for them to kind of date us, to date Christ, to date God. And therefore, it's either nothing or all in. It's kind of, you know, okay, I'll watch from the outside of the car, or I'll get in the back seat with you. It's a weird thing that we do. So I'm all in for what you're trying to do.
You just shouted amen at my sermon there, my
Amen.
friend.
Well, and I'm not sure that I'd have any better, quote unquote, practical ideas than what you're having. I just want to encourage you that philosophically, I think it's dead on, and it's needed for us to figure out these digital front porch spaces.
So I don't want to keep you longer than I need to. I appreciate you so much setting this up and putting this together. It's been really helpful to me.
Thank you.
One of the things that I have a hard time thinking about as far as a practice, just so it's a very pragmatic question. Okay. When do I do things within a group, so I'll give you a little context. So I launched a campus in January, just started building a team. We had 50 something in early March. Now we have 130. And so there are times when I put together like a online prayer gathering or something, and do that through that Facebook group that only connects with 130 people. Mm-hmm. There are other times I might host that exact same thing, but do it on my private personal Facebook page, which I have 5,000 Facebook friends. Okay. Mm-hmm. It changes things in that, the online content is exactly the same thing. Like the video feed shows exactly the same thing, but the interaction and in the comments section is completely different. Mm-hmm. In the sense that, so I did an online Bible. I'm doing a Bible study now that's a Christian Beliefs Made Simple. I'm just walking through doctrines, doing it on my personal Facebook thing on Tuesday nights, and so I have a buddy who, when I met him 15 years ago, he was just finished the military, kind of angry at the world, and he had embraced Buddhism as a way of dealing with his anger. Very intelligent, rugged dude, big beard, lots of tats, really, really sweet guy, but came across, he looks really tough. And so he jumps on my friend. He's not a part of our church, not anyway, not, if you were to ask him, he would not say he is. He jumped on, he probably asked 25 questions in the Bible study, and they were all like questions that most of our regular church-going folks weren't even thinking about.
Right.
But he also was not trying to troll me. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was engaging in this phenomenal, wonderful way, and we would have completely missed that had we done that Bible study within the group that he's not a part of. I'm trying to come up with an understanding of when is a conversation or a connection something that should be done within a limited number of people who are there for a specific reason versus when it's shared with the world and anybody can see it and anybody can participate. I'm sure that's a space question. I'm asking a space question, I think, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
So I think the best way to think about helping with your question is what happens afterward. A lot of times when we did the research, the best results, the aha moments came in after the moments after someone experienced that kind of spatial connection. And therefore it's easy to kind of get insight and definitions a lot of time by what happens after. So for instance, many times I describe personal space as a space that if the activity and or information that's shared coming out of that, if it's shared inappropriately outside of that context, hurts, but it's not devastating.
Okay.
If an intimate sharing, if something is shared outside of an intimate context that was done in an intimate space, it's devastating. So when we think about the mean girl, quote unquote, phenomenon, what happens a lot of times with teenage girls is that they will overshare intimate thoughts and experiences in a space with their very, 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 very best friend, only to find out that tomorrow they become their arch enemy. And when an arch enemy has intimate information, it's devastating. It's not just hurtful, right? So what I would point you to is what would happen if whatever information is shared in public, personal, social, personal, and intimate space, whatever space that you're having the conversation in, what would happen if that information leaked out beyond that space? For instance, in public, there is almost no consequence because it's public sharing, right? Yeah. And so it doesn't matter where that information. Social sharing becomes sometimes will become embarrassing if shared outside of that social space. It not embarrassing in the way that I mean just a little bit of rosiness to the cheeks, not full embarrassment.
Yeah,
does that help?
It does, and I would say in that social space, sometimes we as a church have to be cautious in, say, a sermon that's public and then thrown on video and then shared with the world, the way we might tackle a social topic or churches don't really tackle political topics that often, but just say we're dealing with a personal opinion or a biblical opinion about something that could really draw lines between us and other people. If it's not a conversation, it's just a declaration. And in that sense, we might choose not to have that statement made in a way that we're now going to, we're going to share it 75 times on all social media platforms and anybody and everybody's going to see it. Not because we're hiding the truth, but because we're respecting the space.
That's right. And even down to, a lot of, let's say, smaller congregations, a lot of times a part of their charm and wonderful, and I don't mean charm in a bad way, I mean really great things that are happening in small congregations in live context, is the pastor will many times point out someone by name that's in the group. You have to rethink that when it goes online publicly. Pointing out people by name can become a little bit more embarrassing at times than what they wanted, because their faith isn't as public as what you just made it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So large churches have figured this out a long time ago. If there's 1,000 people in the room, they hardly ever mention someone publicly. They that's just. But when small churches have gone online, I've watched hundreds, maybe not 1,000 yet, but hundreds of online contacts just by interest, and it's just funny how different they are and how much they share in a public space. And I'm like, oh, quit! You've just embarrassed that person to the world.
Yeah.
Not to your physical space like it was before, where everybody knows, oh, this was a little personal time between our congregation and nobody's going to say it outside of these walls. Well, now you just have, kind of thing.
I can even see that the same problem, but flipped on its head, where say the person isn't embarrassed, say the person, it doesn't even matter to them that you shared it publicly, but now someone viewing that from their computer screen at home thinks, I'm never going to that church. Yes. Oh my gosh, I don't want them calling my stuff out publicly in front of everybody, and
well said.
I've known, I'm not going to mention any names, but there are some pretty famous pastors in the early 2000s who got the reputation of being kind of a jerk in their sermons. But when you went into their building and heard the sermon from within the crowd, it just came across so much more loving than it did when it became a podcast or or something like that. And now everybody's listening to it. And one of these particular guys lived in a different part of the country than I do. And so he could say some things there and his people totally rolled off their shoulder like it was no big deal. But if you were to say that in the South or the Midwest, it seems so offensive or so kind of jerk personality. And I'm convinced that people only thought the guy was a jerk because of the fact that they were viewing those sermons from outside of the cultural context that the space existed in. So
yeah, that's exactly it. And a lot of these people who are really successful at broadcasting online or whatever over the years understood this. They understood that this is going to go across several subcultures, and the guys that are successful at that, they just understand.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Well, this has been wonderful, Brad. I sure appreciate it.
Man, you have been we don't even know each other very well, but you have spoken into my life through your books and other things, and I really, really appreciate it. I feel like a lot of the things that I do, some of the framework that helps me do that came from stuff that came out of your computer, so in your mind. So thanks, man. I appreciate it very much, and thanks for inviting me on here. This has been cool.
Yeah, thank you, and just keep me updated. I'd love to hear how things are going. So, because you're pushing it far beyond many people, and so I'd love to keep connected.
Sounds great, man.
All right.
Have a fantastic day.